The ink on the divorce decree was still wet, a stark black signature that felt like the final exhale after years of holding my breath. I sat alone in the sterile conference room of the family law firm, the polished mahogany table reflecting the fluorescent lights overhead like a mocking mirror. My hands trembled slightly as I folded the papers into my leather briefcase, the same one my father had given me on my 25th birthday, back when life still held the promise of forever. Minutes. That was all it took. Minutes after the judge's gavel had sealed the end of my marriage to Mark Harrington, I pulled out my phone with deliberate calm and dialed the only number that had ever truly meant safety. "Daddy," I whispered when he answered on the first ring, my voice barely above a breath. No greetings, no explanations. He didn't need them. We had rehearsed this moment in hushed late-night calls for months, ever since the divorce proceedings turned vicious. "It's done. The papers are signed. Do it now." His response was steady, the voice of a man who had built empires from nothing and protected his only daughter like she was the last fragile thing left in a cruel world. "Already on it, sweetheart, every penny. Consider it gone." The line clicked dead, and I slipped the phone back into my purse, my heart pounding with a ferocious mix of relief and something sharper, revenge, raw and electric, coursing through my veins like fire. Outside, in the parking lot of the courthouse, the celebration had already begun. I could hear it before I even stepped through the glass doors, my ex-mother-in-law's voice, shrill and triumphant, cutting through the humid afternoon air like a blade. Victoria Harrington, the queen of the country club set, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and her pearl necklace that probably cost more than my first car. She was pacing near her sleek black Mercedes, phone pressed to her ear, laughing in that grating, affected way she reserved for her society friends. I paused in the shadow of the building's awning, unseen, my chest tightening with the familiar knot of humiliation that had defined the last decade of my life. "Oh, darling, you wouldn't believe it," Victoria crowed into the phone, her free hand waving dramatically as if conducting an orchestra of her own delusions. "The useless little charity case is finally gone. Signed, sealed, and out of our lives. Mark is free at last, free to build the empire he was always meant for. No more dead weight dragging him down. We're talking about that estate on the lake now. The one with the private dock and the vineyard. His assets are finally unfettered. Generational wealth, restored. I told you she was holding him back, a nobody from nowhere, thinking she could play in our world." Her laughter echoed off the asphalt, mingling with the distant hum of traffic. I stood there, rooted, feeling every word slice into the old wounds she and her son had inflicted so casually over the years. Charity case. That's what they called me from the moment Mark brought me home to their sprawling mansion on the hill. I was 24 then, fresh out of college with a degree in business that I'd earned on scholarships while waitressing nights. Mark was the golden boy, Harvard MBA, trust fund prince, the heir to Harrington Dynamics, the family tech firm that his grandfather had founded. I fell for him hard, the way young women do when charm masks the rot beneath. He swept me off my feet with weekend getaways and promises of partnership, of building something real together. But Victoria, she saw me as a parasite from day one. I remembered the first family dinner like it was yesterday. The silverware clinking against fine china, the air thick with the scent of roasted duck and subtle disdain. "So, Elena," Victoria had said, her smile never reaching her eyes, "what exactly do you bring to the table? Besides your enthusiasm." Mark had laughed it off, squeezing my hand under the table, but the message was clear. I was the outsider, the girl from the modest suburban home whose father ran a small accounting firm. Not old money, not connections, not worthy. Over the years, that disdain festered into something uglier. I poured myself into the company, working unpaid overtime to help launch new product lines, managing the books when Mark's visionary ideas left us bleeding cash. I gave up my own dreams, a startup I'd planned with my college friends, to support his. We built Harrington Dynamics into a multi-million-dollar operation, but in their eyes, I was still the charity case. The one who lucked out by marrying up. The prenup had been ironclad, designed by Victoria's lawyers to protect the family assets, but they forgot one detail: the company operating account. It was the liquid heart of the business, the one I'd been authorized to access as co-signer during the marriage. And in the chaos of the final divorce negotiations, that authorization hadn't been revoked yet. A technicality, my quiet victory. Tears stung my eyes as I watched Victoria from the shadows, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were the hot, cleansing kind, the kind that come when you realize you've survived the storm and emerged sharper. I had loved Mark once, truly. The late nights we spent brainstorming in our tiny apartment before the money rolled in, the way he'd kiss my forehead and call me his anchor. But love had curdled into resentment. He started echoing his mother's barbs. "You're lucky I pulled you out of mediocrity, Elena." The affairs started small, late dinners with clients, and grew bolder. When I confronted him, Victoria swooped in like a vulture, accusing me of paranoia, of being ungrateful. The divorce had been brutal. Custody battles over nothing, we had no children, thank God, accusations of financial mismanagement flung at me like mud, and a settlement offer that would have left me with scraps while they kept the empire. But I had my father. The man who had taught me to read balance sheets before I could ride a bike. He had warned me from the start. That family eats its own, kiddo. Keep your name on nothing you can't walk away from. And so, in secret, we had planned. A trust here, a quiet transfer of my personal investments there. And the company account, the one holding the liquid reserves from our last big contract, nearly $8 million. It was marital property until the papers were signed, but I had the codes, the access. One call, and it was wired to an offshore account in my father's name, earmarked for me. Clean, legal, devastating. I turned away from Victoria's celebration, my heels clicking softly on the pavement as I walked to my unassuming sedan. No Mercedes for me anymore. Just a reliable car that smelled like freedom. The drive home to the small apartment I'd rented in anticipation of this day was a blur of memories. I thought of the nights I'd cried myself to sleep after Victoria's casual lunches where she'd introduce me as Mark's little project. The way she'd bragged to her country club cronies about how she'd rescued her son from a mismatched marriage. The isolation. Mark had slowly cut me off from my own friends, painting me as the unstable one. But through it all, my father's voice had been my lifeline. They think they own the world, Elena, but worlds crumble when you pull the right thread. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the bare walls I hadn't bothered to decorate yet, and let the emotions wash over me in waves. Grief for the girl I used to be, the one who believed in fairy tales. Fury at the years I had wasted proving myself to people who would never see my worth. And beneath it all, a quiet, humming satisfaction. They had underestimated me. The charity case. The nobody. I whispered to the empty room, "You don't get to win this one, Victoria." The next morning dawned bright and unforgiving, the kind of spring day that mocks heartbreak with its cheer. I wasn't at the bank, of course. I didn't need to be. My father had arranged for a discreet contact at the branch, a longtime friend from his Rotary days, who would feed me the details later. But I could picture it so vividly, as if I were there in the marble lobby, watching from behind a potted fern. Victoria arrived at precisely 10 o'clock, as she always did for her weekly account reviews. She was a vision of generational wealth, tailored cream pantsuit hugging her slender frame, Louboutin heels clicking with authority, a designer handbag swinging from her arm like a trophy. Her face glowed with the after-party high from yesterday's victory, cheeks flushed, lips painted a victorious red. She breezed past the tellers with a nod, heading straight for the private client manager's office. "Good morning, Charles," she trilled, settling into the leather chair like it was her throne. "Just a quick check on the Harrington Dynamics operating account. We'll be transferring a sizable sum for that lake estate. Mark's already scouting properties." Charles, the manager, was a kind-faced man in his 50s, the one my father had tipped off. He cleared his throat, his expression carefully neutral as he typed into the computer. The silence stretched for a beat too long. Victoria's smile faltered just a fraction. "Is there a problem?" "I'm sorry, ma'am," Charles said, his voice steady but laced with the professional regret of someone delivering bad news to the untouchable. "But this account has been completely emptied. Balance shows zero. Funds were transferred out late yesterday afternoon." The color drained from Victoria's face in an instant, like someone had pulled a plug on her very essence. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her pearl necklace, clutching it as if it could anchor her to the world she knew. "What? That's impossible. There must be some error. Check again." Her voice cracked on the last word, the bravado shattering like fine crystal under a hammer. Charles turned the screen toward her gently, the glowing numbers a cold indictment. Zero. Not a penny left. The operating account, the one that funded their lifestyle, their club dues, the private jets, the staff at the mansion, was gone. Emptied with surgical precision. Victoria's eyes widened, pupils dilating in shock, and for the first time in her privileged life, she looked small. Vulnerable. The reality crashed over her like a tidal wave. The massive estate, the country club brunches, the inheritance she'd lorded over everyone. All of it teetered on the edge of collapse. Her sons, newly freed assets, were a mirage. The brilliant boy was now just a man with a company stripped bare, creditors circling like sharks. Tears, real ones, not the crocodile variety she used to manipulate, welled in her eyes. This can't be. Elena, that little bitch. She did this. Her voice rose to a hysterical pitch, drawing stares from the other clients. The perfect picture of generational wealth crumbled in real time, shoulders slumping, lips trembling, the facade of superiority evaporating under the fluorescent lights. She fumbled for her phone, dialing Mark with shaking fingers. "Get over here now," she hissed when he answered. "The account, it's empty. She took everything." I learned all this later, of course, from my father's contact and the inevitable gossip that rippled through our once shared social circles. But in that moment, as I sat in my apartment sipping coffee from a chipped mug, I felt it. A surge of emotion so profound it left me breathless. Not glee, exactly, though there was a spark of it, bright and unapologetic. It was deeper. Validation. The years of being dismissed, belittled, erased, they had weight now. I had carried that weight in silence, forging it into this single, decisive act. My father called me shortly after, his voice warm with pride. "It's done, kiddo. Wire confirmed. And word is, Victoria's having a full meltdown at the bank." "You okay?" I laughed then, a sound that started shaky and built into something freer. "I'm more than okay, Dad. I'm alive again." The tears came, but they were different now, cathartic, washing away the residue of a decade spent shrinking myself to fit their mold. I thought of Mark, probably pacing his empty office right now, realizing the empire he'd inherited was hollow without the foundation I had helped lay. Victoria, whose cruelty had been her currency, was bankrupt in every sense. The days that followed unfolded like a slow unraveling of their world. Mark showed up at my apartment unannounced 2 days later, his designer suit rumpled, eyes bloodshot from what I assumed was a sleepless night of damage control. "Elena," he pleaded, voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since our early days. "What the hell did you do?" "Mom's inconsolable. The company, payroll's due next week. Suppliers are calling. We'll lose everything." I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, feeling taller than I had in years. The old Elena might have crumbled, offered to fix it, to save him. But this one, the one who had survived their scorn, felt only a quiet steel. "I did what you and your mother taught me, Mark. I protected what was mine. You called me charity case for 10 years. You let her treat me like dirt under your expensive shoes. The account was joint until those papers were signed. Legal, fair. You took my youth, my dreams. I took the money we built together." He stared at me, really stared, as if seeing me for the first time. "I loved you once," he whispered, but it sounded hollow, like an echo from a forgotten room. "And I loved you," I replied, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "But love doesn't excuse cruelty. Go home, Mark. Tell your mother the estate will have to wait. Maybe she can sell some pearls." He left without another word, shoulders hunched like a man carrying the weight of his own making. I closed the door and leaned against it, sliding down to the floor as sobs shook me, not of regret, but of release. The emotions tumbled out. The loneliness of quiet dinners where Victoria's barbs went unchecked, the isolation of holidays spent pretending to belong, the quiet rage of watching my contributions erased from boardroom narratives. I had been invisible to them, a supporting character in their grand story. Now, they felt the void I left behind. Word spread quickly in the tight-knit circles of the city. Victoria, once the untouchable hostess, became a cautionary tale whispered over martinis at the club. "Did you hear about the Harringtons? That ex-wife cleaned them out the day the divorce was final." Bold as brass, some pitied her, others, the ones who had endured her snubs over the years, savored the fall. I didn't gloat publicly. That wasn't me. Instead, I focused on rebuilding. My father helped me invest the funds wisely, starting a small consulting firm of my own, one that celebrated women who had been underestimated. I reached out to old friends I had lost touch with during the marriage, and their support wrapped around me like a warm blanket. "We always knew you were the brains behind that company," one said over coffee, her eyes shining with pride. For the first time in years, I believed it. Victoria tried one last desperate play a month later. She showed up at my father's office, uninvited, her face gaunt and her usual poise fractured. I was there, helping him review some ledgers, when the receptionist buzzed us. "Mrs. Harrington insists on seeing you both." We let her in, curiosity outweighing caution. She looked diminished, the pearls still there, but dull against her pale skin. "Elena," she began, voice trembling with a mix of fury and desperation. "You've ruined us. My son is devastated. The company is hemorrhaging. Surely you have some decency left. We treated you like family." The audacity stole my breath for a second. Family. The word hung between us like a lie exposed. I met her gaze, unflinching, the emotions I had bottled for so long rising to the surface. "Family," I echoed, my voice low and steady. "You treated me like an intruder, Victoria. A charity case you tolerated only because Mark was infatuated. You bragged about freeing him from me while I stood feet away, signing away a life I had fought to build beside him. You mocked my background, my efforts, my love. Decency. I showed you more than you ever showed me. I could have dragged this out in court for years, bled you dry legally. Instead, I took what was fair, and walked away. Live with it." Tears slipped down her cheeks then, genuine and unscripted. She sank into a chair, the fight draining from her. I didn't think you had it in you. None of us did. That was the mistake," I said softly, the satisfaction tempered by a strange compassion I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness, no, never that, but an understanding that cruelty often stems from fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of irrelevance. You assumed I was nothing because that's what made you feel powerful. But I was always everything you feared. Capable, resilient, done waiting for your approval. She left without another word, the door closing softly behind her. My father placed a hand on my shoulder, his eyes misty. "Proud of you, kiddo. Always have been." In the months that followed, life bloomed in ways I hadn't dared imagine. The company account money became seed capital for my own venture, a network for women entrepreneurs who had escaped toxic partnerships, offering mentorship and funding without the strings of judgment. I named it Thread, a quiet nod to the one I had pulled to unravel their empire. Mark filed for bankruptcy protection eventually, the brilliant boy reduced to selling off assets to stay afloat. Victoria retreated to a smaller home, her country club invitations drying up as the scandal lingered like perfume on stale air. I heard she still bragged sometimes, but the fire was gone, replaced by a hollow echo. As for me, I found peace in the ordinary. Mornings spent journaling the emotions that had once threatened to drown me, anger that had sharpened into purpose, sorrow that had softened into wisdom. Evenings walking in the park near my new townhouse, the one I bought with my own earnings, no inheritance required. I dated cautiously, on my terms, meeting a kind architect who listened without interruption and never once called me charity. Love, when it came again, felt lighter, built on equality rather than illusion. Looking back now, years later, that quiet phone call remains the pivot point of my life. Not because it destroyed them, though it did, in measured ways, but because it rebuilt me. The woman who signed those papers was emerging from a cocoon of self-doubt. The one who drained that account flew free. Victoria's pale face at the bank, her world collapsing in real time, was the mirror I needed. Proof that power isn't inherited or assumed, it's claimed, quietly, fiercely, by those who refuse to stay small. I still think of her sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the sun slants just right through my office window. Not with hatred, but with a profound sense of closure. She had celebrated my erasure in that parking lot, sure that her son's freedom meant her continued reign. Instead, it marked the beginning of mine. The charity case, she had become the architect of her own downfall, and the savior of her own soul. And in the end, that was the sweetest revenge of all. Not their poverty, but my abundance, a life rich with purpose, unapologetic joy, and the unshakable knowledge that I had always been enough.